Hey guys, Heidi Preeb here. Welcome to my channel if you're new. On this channel, we talk about attachment theory, personality types, and all things that help us understand ourselves and other people better. So today we are talking about the avoidant attachment style and which early experiences lead children to develop this style. So generally, our attachment styles form before the age of 2 or 3, and they do grow and dynamically change with us over the course of our lives. However, if we do not do specific therapeutic intervention on our attachment styles, generally our adult attachment experiences, in a more sophisticated and complex way, mimic our early experiences of attachment. And the reason this happens is because when we are 1 or 2 years old, our brains are incredibly malleable. We are taking in a butt ton of information about the world and what makes it up, particularly how we exist in relation to other people, because our caregivers are our first experiences of getting our needs met in the world. And so the things that we learn at that age get hardwired into our brain. And the way that that happens is through the process of neurons continuously firing and wiring together, right? So if you have one experience paired with another experience over and over and over again, your brain learns these two things are related to each other. And then as we grow up, we learn to depend on that information and seek out experiences that meet that worldview. Whatever we expect in the world, we tend to end up finding. So our very early experiences of attachment and of the relationships that we form with the people who brought us into this world, or the people who elected to raise us from a young age, become the primary lens through which we view all relationships, especially intimate relationships where there is some type of interdependency involved, which is probably already a term that feels very uncomfortable if you are avoidantly attached. Now, the early environment of avoidantly attached adults was often one that was consistent and predictable, but it was consistently and predictably hostile. So what that means is that certain emotions were rejected by their caregivers. Now, this is important, and this is also very difficult to process because when you're an infant, your emotions and your displays of emotion are your only way to communicate how you'll have your needs met. So imagine if currently you lived in a world where everyone else was using money all the time to get their needs met. Like, you could buy a house with money, you can buy food with money, but for some reason, every time you went and tried to use money, it was rejected. Didn't matter if you used credit, debit, cash, whatever it was, every time you went and tried to pay for something with money, the person was like, sorry, we don't take your money. You would learn, my money is not worth anything. Ergo, I have to find an alternate way of gathering resource that does not involve money. And you might find if I go, let's say, view an apartment, and I tell the person I'm interested in this apartment, but don't bring up money at all, and then the person offers you the apartment without any money being exchanged, you would quickly learn me not talking about money is actually the thing that gets me the thing that other people use money to buy. And this is similar to how emotion works for the avoidantly attached person. So when you were a very young child, whatever it was in your caregiver that left them unable to process and mirror your negative emotional experiences led you to believe that if I deny and repress my negative emotions, I get my needs met. So let's say your parent was someone who was avoidantly attached themselves. So anytime you cried or made a fuss or showed anger, your parent may have wanted to be emotionally present, but they may have unconsciously been very rejecting of your displays of emotion. It's also possible if you had an anxiously attached caregiver, they saw your displays of emotion as a threat because maybe they went, wait, I need my emotional needs met. If I spend all my time tending to this person's emotional needs, who's going to see and care for mine? So there may have consciously or unconsciously, likely unconsciously, been a reason why your parent was consistently a little bit hostile, detached, unable to be present with your emotional displays as a child. And this doesn't mean they didn't give you what you needed in terms of physical resources, but they didn't learn to tend to your emotional experiences and be present with you when you were displaying emotion. Now, for most children, emotions are currency. So they can exchange crying for being soothed. They can exchange anger for getting an injustice noticed. They can exchange the expression of fear for protection. But for you, you learned that when you expressed negative emotions, no one would take your currency. It was not accepted at the location that was your caregiver, So you learn to get what I want, I have to suppress my own negative emotion. It's not that as an infant you had something against negative emotions. You just learned through conditioning. Showing my emotions is not useful. It does not get me what I want. In some cases, it actually might get me rejected. So what I have to do to get my needs met is appear as though I don't have emotions, or appear as though the only emotions I feel are positive. So maybe my parent is very responsive to me when I'm giggling or making a joke or when I smile at them. And so I learned, okay, positive emotions are good. Positive emotions are okay to show, but negative ones like crying or screaming or being angry don't get me anywhere. And so your brain actually learns from a very young age to start dismissing negative emotional experiences. So whereas another child will go, oh, I'm angry, it must mean that I'm experiencing an injustice in my environment. And if I bring it to the attention of my caregiver, they will help me by either explaining to me why this is happening in a way that soothes my anger because I now understand what I thought was an injustice is not, because there's a different reason than I thought behind it. Or my parent will help me by going, you're right, that is an injustice, let's fight against it, or let's correct the situation. But you may have learned when I feel anger, if I express it, I actually get left alone. So the best case scenario is that I keep quiet when I'm angry, don't tell anyone how I'm feeling, and find a way to get my need met in other ways. Your feelings were seen as unimportant information, so your brain did not learn to focus very hard on them. Instead, your brain learned to be quite strategic about noticing, my parent does respond to this. Here's kind of the rules that govern my physical environment. And you learn to play into those rules. That probably gave you a pretty good ability to navigate the world of cause and effect, but as an adult, if you have an avoidant attachment style, you still probably have a very low level of awareness around your negative emotional experiences, to the point where you might actually only notice this is the case when something happens to you, let's say a death or a breakup or something, that you feel like you should feel a strong negative emotion around. It makes sense to you that other people experience this response in relation to that stimuli, but you just can't feel the feelings that you think you're supposed to feel. Now, this does not mean that you're a psychopath. This is not divorced from the ability to feel empathy, which avoidants very much possess. It's about being desensitized to your own emotional experiences, particularly with negative emotions. You learned to first assess the situation, figure out which emotions were acceptable within that situation, and then feel whichever emotions you believe are appropriate for that situation. So if you have a feeling come up that you think doesn't really make sense for you to be having, your instinct is to find a way to dismiss that emotion within yourself or talk yourself out of the experience of that emotion. So you might feel angry, and instead of taking that anger seriously and going, something must be happening that's unjust, which is why this feeling of anger is coming up for me, you might first look at your environment, and if you can't find something that very blatantly indicates that your anger is valid, you probably assume that your feeling is incorrect and kind of rationalize with yourself and go, well, it doesn't make sense for me to be angry. Ergo, I must not be angry. I must be wrong about my feeling, or I must find a way to get rid of that feeling. And so as an adult, the process of healing from an avoidant attachment style becomes the process of re-sensitizing yourself to your emotional experiences and being able to unpair cause and effect from your emotions. So what that looks like is being able to validate your emotional experience without validating the external environment that might be causing it. So for example, you might feel like, ooh, I'm really jealous, but it doesn't make sense for me to be feeling jealous because my partner is free to, let's say, have crushes on other people. But instead of deciding that your emotion is wrong, you can learn emotions do not always dictate the way that I need to act. And the problem is when we're insecurely attached, most of us have paired emotion with action. So we think if I feel jealous, I have to get angry or I have to rage or whatever it is. But you can learn, I can feel jealous, and I can maybe bring that feeling to a counselor and work with it and try to figure out if there's something in my relationship that even though my partner is not giving me a reason to feel insecure, I'm still feeling. And maybe there's something subtle there that you've never noticed because you don't have that inner sensitization to your own feelings. So you might only feel a certain thing once it crosses a threshold of being very strong. So maybe there have been 10 different instances in which you've seen your partner kind of subtly flirting with other people or whatever it is that have eventually crossed this threshold of you feeling jealous. And instead of saying, that doesn't make sense because I don't have a singular overt reason to feel that way, working with a professional can help you understand all of the tiny little instances that eventually lead to you feeling a certain way, which is often how emotions show up. They are the accumulation of many different pieces of information that eventually compile into a whole. And often you find that whole easy to dismiss if it is not represented by a singular, blatant, undeniable experience in your environment. So you might go, if they're not actually cheating, if they're not literally having sex with another person behind my back and not telling me about it, I have no reason to feel jealous. But that's not necessarily true. But you don't need a blatant reason to feel a feeling, right? Feelings just are. And how you choose to act on them is not a direct reflection of what you're feeling. You can learn to feel one way and act another way without having to dismiss the way that you feel. So I'm going to make a video in the future about the value of dealing with negative emotions as someone who has an avoidant attachment style. But for now, we're just kind of laying down the bare basics of how you arrived at a place where you believed that negative emotions had little to no value. Now, there's another factor that comes into play with avoidant attachment, which is having a sense of over-responsibility for one's problems. So at a first glance, this can look like a good thing, and avoidants do tend to pride themselves on solving all their own problems, being very self-reliant, not needing other people, or not being a burden on other people, but they can do this at the expense of their own accurate view of the world. So, because avoidantly attached children learned not to go to their caregivers and expect things like sympathy or support or to have their worldview validated, they learned, I have to find a way to feel like I am in control of my life. And the way that I can do that is by making everything about me. Now, children naturally do this. This is not exclusive to avoidant attachment. All children naturally feel like they are the center of the universe and everything that happens to them in some way is a reflection of who they are as a person. The difference is that because avoidant children did not learn to co-regulate the same way that other children did, which means they did not learn to take those worldviews, take the negative emotions that they feel, bring them to someone who's older and wiser and has a better idea of what's going on than them, and who might be able to disconfirm that this thing is about them. So that kind of childhood view of everything that happens is because I caused it is still relatively present in avoidantly attached adults. So there's this deep inner sense of almost like I don't exist in relationship with other people. So what that means is all of the results that I get in life must be because of something I did. It couldn't possibly be that someone else is impacting the way that I'm experiencing life or the things that are happening to me. And this can lead to very flawed thinking. There's also another video that I'm going to make that talks about specifically your experience of repulsion as an adult with an avoidant attachment style. So a lot of avoidantly attached adults often find that they feel very readily kind of repulsed or disgusted by certain things that maybe their partner does or even that their children do. And often this is a roadmap to figuring out which emotions were consistently rejected in you as a child, which are now shame-bound for you. So when you are very young and your caregiver consistently rejects or shows disgust at you expressing a certain emotion, you learn having that emotion is shameful, and expressing it is especially shameful. So as an adult, often when you see other people, let's say exaggerating their vulnerability, exaggerating their need, exaggerating how sad they are, you might feel an almost overwhelming feeling of disgust, and you might want to distance yourself from that as much as humanly possible. Now, you might be correct in that those displays are over the top, especially if you're surrounding yourself with people who have more of an anxious attachment style, which in the anxious video, we talk about why those displays are often kind of heightened as an adult. But you learned as a child that one should be rejected if one displays those emotions. So you might actually feel quite angry when you see other people expressing those emotions and having them taken seriously, because you think that the way the world should work is that if you repress all of those emotions, if you deal with everything on your own without asking for help, you should be rewarded for that. But often, this is not how the world works. Often, people do show their emotions and have their needs met by showing those emotions. And that can feel infuriating to you because, again, it's kind of like someone walking into a situation, offering money, and having it be accepted, where you learned very early on, my money is not accepted. And that feels unjust on a deep level. But that sense of injustice isn't necessarily what's conscious for you. What's conscious for you is that internalized feeling of disgust and rage that you feel from having those emotions rejected in you from a very young age. So I actually think that it's very interesting when you have an adult with an avoidant attachment style, because that conscious feeling of anger, of rage, of disgust towards other people often is pointing you directly and specifically to which emotions you have learned to repress in yourself. And those are the precise emotions you need to resensitize yourself to in order to begin the healing process. But again, we're going to cover that a lot more in another video. Now, the last thing you need to know about avoidant attachment is that the way you dealt with a large amount of your uncomfortable feelings as a child, if you have an avoidant attachment style, was denying and repressing them. So again, this is something that your brain does without you choosing that. It's just that focusing on your emotions didn't get you anywhere. So it's kind of like your brain was always sorting through which of your emotions were useful and which were not, and throwing a large amount of them in this repression bin. And a lot of what got thrown in that repression bin was blame. So you learned, when I express my negative emotions, because that's kind of what blame is, right? It's expressing our negative emotions and saying to someone else, I need help. I need your participation, either in the form of words or reparative actions, because something you've done has hurt me. So we put the way that we're feeling on someone else. And again, there are lots of cases where it's not healthy to blame people, but there are many cases where it's actually very reasonable to go to someone and say, the way that you're showing up in our relationship is affecting me negatively, and I need to have boundaries around that if you are unwilling to change that behavior. However, as a child, because blame did not work for you, because going to your caregiver and saying, I feel hurt or rejected or whatever else, did not get you anywhere, you learned not to blame. And you learned, if I have a negative emotion, it's my responsibility to deal with it or to just disengage with the situation that's causing it. And as a result, you tend to overtake responsibility for situations where actually blame is healthy. So especially when we have someone who is very avoidantly attached, because like anything, it is a spectrum, you'll often see cases of, let's say, early child abuse, where the person with an avoidant attachment style cannot recognize it as abuse, because calling something abuse is a form of blame, right? It's about saying the way I feel is the result of someone else's actions. And that very act of assuming that their emotional experience is impacted by someone else is very threatening to the way that the avoidant learned to process the world. So often their mind finds a way to frame even abuse that happened to them through almost a rose-colored lens. So they are very quick to exonerate their caregivers when they talk about their early experiences, and they might say something like, oh yeah, my dad always used to beat me up, but it was for my own good. I was a bad kid and I deserved it, and he taught me a lesson. There is this inaccessibility of the pain and the fear and the vulnerability that was absolutely, on some level, felt by that young abused child. But the way that the brain learned to compensate was to dismiss those emotions and decide that what was happening was actually for their own good. And again, in the healing process for people with avoidant attachment styles, there's often a long process of learning to recontextualize one's life experiences and finding out in which areas the way that you were feeling actually kind of was caused by something outside of you. Resensitizing yourself to the emotions that would have been appropriate in that situation were it to have happened to a securely attached child who had access to their entire emotional range, or at least much more of their emotional range than anyone on the insecure spectrum had. And then learning to have compassion for the child that you were as the adult you now are with new information. But again, before that process begins, it can actually be very difficult for people with avoidant attachment styles to even figure out where their attachment style came from, because very often people with avoidant attachment styles look back on their pasts as very rosy, as nothing went wrong, as everything that happened was for my own good. And one of the only strong indications that might come up for you that this is your attachment style is by noticing just how much disgust you have for people who do play the victim, right? That's often a key indication that you were never allowed to play the victim. So your brain had to find a different way to cope with the circumstances in which you actually were a victim. It's actually really interesting because when I did my family roles series, so talking about all of the dysfunctional family roles that children can take on in parent-centered homes, which means family systems that operate around meeting the emotional needs of the parents rather than the children, I had this one comment that was like, oh great, you're just making more victims out of people. And I thought that that comment was really interesting because you cannot make more victims out of people. If you are alive, if you have been on this earth for more than like a day, you are absolutely a victim of something. Everyone at some point in their lives has been a victim of something. No one, not a single person out there, has made it through life without ever having something negative happen to them at the hands of someone else's gain. That is just the human experience. Even the most securely attached parents will every once in a while prioritize themselves over their children, if only for a moment or two. So there is no way to create more victims, but the idea that one could have made it through their entire life without ever having been victimized in any way is absolutely very avoidant. It is that avoidant mindset of everything that happened to me, I'm responsible for, and I've never been a victim of anything else. Now, this does not mean you have to swing all the other way to the other side of the spectrum, which is I'm a victim of everything and nothing that happens to me is ever my fault. There is a very healthy, secure middle ground where you look at the situation and figure out, are other people trying to take advantage of me? And if so, I will form boundaries around them, but for the most part, I will engage in good faith with people. But often you do get that really polarized worldview between avoidant and anxious people, where the avoidant people think that everyone's playing the victim, and the anxious person thinks that they're a victim of everyone else's bad behavior, and both don't realize that there is a very healthy middle ground where you just understand actual realistic cause and effect. And that is where we are all trying to head towards, ideally, in our healing journey, is towards that secure earned attachment where you're able to finally integrate the parts of your psyche that you have repressed from a very young age. So whether that is the ability to feel, express, and process negative emotion, like the avoidant attachment, or the ability to process and integrate self-responsibility and cause and effect, like the anxious attachment, at the end of the day, it all leads to the same place, which is that healthy, balanced middle ground. So we will be talking more in future videos about how to get there. But for now, let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Thank you for coming to hang out with me again for another half hour or so on YouTube. I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you back here again soon.